The following podcast is brought to you by PeacemakerNetwork.com. PeacemakerNetwork.com. Audio is provided by Pixabay.com. That's Pixabay.com.
In Orlando, the home of Disney World, well, the Jennifer Kesse cold case has just turned hot. And we're going to talk about that and more on this episode of Charlie Crime Buster. It is what some people are calling, well, they're calling it the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the individuals participating and do not represent those of city, county, state, or federal law enforcement agencies, nor sponsors and platforms of this presentation. The Charlie Crime Buster name and all forms and abbreviations are property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. All individuals described or mentioned in the presentation should be considered innocent unless or until found guilty in a court of law. This presentation contains adult subject matter. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to the Charlie Crime Buster podcast today. Glad to have you on board the Charlie train, as we call it. The crime train, that is. And today we're going to be talking about the disappearance of Jennifer Kesse. It is a cold case that's just turned hot. Thank you for joining with us. Be sure and do us a favor. Whatever platform that you're listening on to right now, hit that like button and also hit that subscribe button. We'd like to keep you as a member of the Charlie Crime Buster Crime Junkie Crime Train. That's right. Took a lot to get that out, right? Well, we're glad to have you folks. Thank you for joining with us. We'll be telling you some other things about the podcast, so if you'd like to pick up our YouTube channel and other things, you'll see it as we go along. Also, you see it in the show notes. Well, folks, my friend, I have the opportunity right now to live here in Central Florida, home of Disney World. And we do welcome millions of people here to explore a unique place of fun for the family. But little do some people realize that in the midst of laughing and enjoying, there are also tears and grief. For in the real world, apart from the fairy tales of Disney, people, unfortunately, are murdered, and people are missing. You could just ask Drew and Joyce Kesse from Bradenton, Florida, and they will tell you about tears that was shed here in Orlando. For 19 years ago, their beautiful daughter, Jennifer, went missing. And, my friend, she's not the only one that has gone missing from the I-4 corridor that's running through Orlando to Daytona Beach. But there is now news that this cold case has turned hot, and we're going to share with you all about that and the case that one time garnered national attention. But we need to be careful, my friend, not to judge others without thinking it through, especially when it comes to missing persons and homicides. I myself have made comments about the Holloway case that I thought may have been solved a whole lot sooner had it happened on America's soil other than Aruba. But the truth of the matter is, it happens throughout America as well. And sometimes these cases go unsolved. In fact, Orlando, which is home to several tourist hotspots, well, it's also been the scene of several unsolved murder and disappearances cases. Families and loved ones sometimes are left in limbo, and they anguish when sometimes these cases just drag on and on and on and on without resolution. In fact, around 200 unsolved homicides have been reported to the Orlando Police Department. Some of those, of course, date way back to 1970. But over 60 of these have gone unresolved for at least 3 years, which makes them cold cases. There are several disappearances and missing persons that have likewise gone cold and have not been solved. In fact, since 1980, there's been 1,500 homicides in Orlando, around 37 per year on average. Yet, homicide rates have changed from time to time, increasing in the 90s and early 2000s, but have now begun to level off in more recent years. In fact, there was a recent article that ranked the city of Orlando as high as 64th in Florida cities as it comes to crime. It ranked Orlando as one of the most dangerous Florida city and town for violent crime. And in terms of property crime, it ranks among the most dangerous in Florida. Now, that is not to say you should stay away, because most of our tourist spots are well protected, and we have some of the best law enforcement officials in the world that are a part of our team of law enforcement here in Florida. But late at night and into the morning, you should, as in any city, use caution. In fact, our police chief, the new police chief in Orlando, Eric Smith, he now says that violent crime in the city has decreased the past year. He's reporting significant reductions. Shootings down 40%. Armed robberies decreased by 30%. Homicides down 15%. But back in 2006, when Jennifer Kesse went missing, crime was high compared to other Florida cities. Now, in today's program, you're going to see a family that actually set an example of being very proactive in finding their daughter. I have to say, right on first here in this podcast, I respect and admire this couple, Drew and Joyce, in their quest to find out what happened to their daughter on that day in 2006. And we're going to get to that later, but first, let's talk about the victim, Jennifer Kesse. Jennifer is a graduate of Tampa, Florida. She attended the University of Central Florida here in Orlando, and she graduated in 2003 with a degree in finance. At the time of her disappearance, well, she was working here in Central Florida at Central Florida Investments, which was a timeshare company right here in Central Florida. She had recently bought her own condo in Orlando. The weekend before she vanished, well, Jennifer vacationed with her boyfriend all the way in the Virgin Islands. In fact, her father was talking about how much fun that both of she and her boyfriend had there and how she was telling the family about how much she enjoyed it. Now, when they returned on Sunday, she spent that first night at her boyfriend's home in Fort Lauderdale. Then she drove straight to work on the morning of Monday, January the 23rd, 2006. So now, as we often do on our crime investigations, we're going to take time to look at the timeline of this cold case that turned hot again. As James Buckland, our producer, and I talk about the podcast every week in our midweek recording that we put on YouTube, we often say that the timeline is one of the best ways to get your head wrapped around a case. So we're going to go back to the timeline of what happened to Jennifer. Now, we've already told you that she returned from the vacation trip that she and her boyfriend took there in the Virgin Islands. She came back to Fort Lauderdale, and there she drove to her work in Central Florida on that Monday morning. Now, that afternoon, on Monday, January the 23rd, 2006, around 6 p.m., she's leaving work and she calls her parents. Now, her parents, Drew and Joyce, say that they talked often, almost every day. And so it was very uncommon if at any time they could not reach either one of them. This, my friend, though, unfortunately, at 6 p.m. on Monday evening, was the very last time that her family heard from him. She arrived home for the first time since having left that vacation. Now, at 10 o'clock that same evening of January the 23rd, Jennifer was talking to her boyfriend by phone, and they said their good night. By the way, he, her boyfriend, is the last known person to speak with her before her disappearance. He lives in Fort Lauderdale, or lived there, rather. So on Tuesday, January the 24th, the very next day, from 7:30 and 8 a.m., pay attention to that time, 7:30 and 8, this is when investigators now believe that Jennifer was abducted, and they think that it happened maybe as she was walking from the front door to her car. But now they believe, or saying now, that they believe that she was abducted at some point on her way to work. Between 8 and 9 a.m., Jennifer's boyfriend, who she normally called but did not, well, he called her because he was on the way to work, but this time, instead of reaching her, the call went directly to the voicemail. And he thought, well, maybe she did, he recalled, remember a meeting that she was going to attend, and so he thought, well, no big deal. But then he began to try additional times to reach her and could not reach him. Then Jennifer's parents, they turn around and call him the boyfriend and say that she failed to show up at work. Well, of course, this alarmed everybody that was involved because she was just not a no-call, no-show person. You see, there are some people that we know are no-call, no-show people. We, in our work, employ a great deal of people who are involved in the security field, and we find that sometimes there are people, if they don't show up, you know something bad has happened. And in this case, that's what her employer knew. So immediately he contacts their parents. Andrew and Joyce began immediately to drive from Tampa up here to Orlando. Now, on the way, they're realizing that time is of essence when something like this happens. So they contact the manager of her condo. And they ask that manager to check her home with a spare key. He did. And he said, well, everything appeared normal inside, but that her car was missing. It wasn't parked outside. Now, that same day at 12 o'clock p.m., which is only about 1.2 miles, I believe it was, is what I read, about a little over a mile from Jennifer's home, surveillance cameras at a nearby apartment complex. Well, those cameras record an unknown person parking her car, parking Jennifer's car, and walking away. Now, this is an apartment complex about a mile from her home. But, of course, that wasn't discovered till about 2 days later. So around 3 o'clock, somewhere around that time, Jennifer's parents and her brother arrives to her apartment. They walk in to the home that day, and they see evidence that she had been home that morning. Think they found some clothes laid out upon the bed and a wet towel. So they turn around, they call the police. And, of course, Jennifer's an adult, and police initially, well, they say that she may have left on her own volition. Now, get this. This is what really amazed me about this case. The very day that probably this alleged event took place, the very day that the family was contacted, that very day that she did not show up at work, that same day between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the evening, guess what? Family and friends were saturating the area with flyers that would show Jennifer's picture. The police then sent a detective to her home, and they began to do interviews and searches. That was how fast this thing got moving on this investigation. I think it's amazing to me, and that is why it's so important. That's why we have shows, as I said last week, called 48 Hours, because those first hours are critical. This family recognized that. This family already had posters going out on that very evening. So 2 days later, of course, Thursday, some people saw her car on the news. It was a tenant there that lived at that nearby complex. And they contacted the police and said, we see the car. It's out there in front of our apartment. It's been there for several days. She had I think it was a Chevy Malibu, a 2004 Chevy Malibu. And it was actually parked in front of this other person's condo. So the police come over, they photograph it, they take it for all kinds of forensic examinations. And then they begin to look at the local surveillance footage from the camera. And they do discover an unidentified person parking her car and walking away. Now, again, before we get really hard into this investigation, I want to point out how proactive the family has been for these answers, because I think it's amazing. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk more about this investigation. Her car has now been found 2 days later after she was missing. What happens next? Well, we're going to tell you all about that, but now it's time for us to take a little break and take a breath from this dark reporting that we do on these programs, and let me share with you for just a quick moment Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. Well, as I've often said in Florida, you do not have to look very far to find a crazy crook. In fact, this week, all we have to do is look a little further over to the panhandle of Florida and in beautiful Escambia County. Escambia County with its beautiful beaches of white sand. And there, my friend, is where we find our crazy crook of the week. You could call it a game of hide and seek. Often that happens when you're looking for these guys who are fugitives. And this was a Florida man, of course, a Florida man who was wanted for multiple felonies. And they found him. Yep, they found him. But of all the places, I believe we could do a whole program on just very unusual places where these crazy crooks hide and think that they can get away with it. Well, this guy was hiding for sure. He was hiding, are you ready for this? He was hiding inside a clothes dryer. That's right, clothes dryer. And there they found him, folded up inside a dryer. That's where the county deputies found him. They described the man as looking guilty, embarrassed, and, of course, warm. You know how we put on those warm clothes when we pull them out of the dryer? Well, he was warm. And they did pull him out. Pulled him out, had to do it one limb at a time. And also, they pulled with him dryer sheets, mismatched socks, and a wrinkled Star Wars shirt. Yeah, this crazy crook who previously served 7 years for various crimes, well, he was taken to jail again on a $120,000 bond. And while the sheriff's office had a little fun with this quirky arrest, they did remind everybody of the charges of the remaining allegations that were, of course, free from static cling. So, my friend, this crazy crook who thought he could outsmart cops by hiding in a dryer ended up going to the slammer instead. And he is indeed Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. Now back to our main focus. The investigation into the missing of Jennifer is quite interesting. In fact, if you lived in Florida, as I did at the time of her disappearance, you could not but help notice that the area was full of posters and even billboards seeking the attention of the public in solving the case. This is how Jennifer's dad, his name is Drew, how he remembers that call, of course, that he will never forget. The call he will never forget. He said about an hour and a half into the workday, and I'm quoting him, I received a call from her work. That's what he told Fox News. And they said, hey, Jennifer had a meeting this morning. It's not like her to not show up. Do you know where she is? Her dad said he immediately tried to reach his daughter, relying on a family rule that they would always answer each other's calls. But this call went straight to voicemail. Drew goes on to say, I knew that something was wrong immediately. And of course, then he and his wife made that 2-hour drive that we talked about earlier to Orlando from Tampa. There, they did find the apartment empty, several outfit choices laid out on the bed. But with no sign of forced entry or struggle, investigators did come to the theory that they thought that it happened sometime after she left her apartment for work. Her front door was locked, and they think that sometime she was abducted, either walking toward or getting into the car. And again, as we pointed out, January the 26th, a couple of days later, they found that parked at the apartment complex. They were excited, though, when they found that there were certain cameras around that apartment that did surveillance to the part where the car had been parked. And that footage sure enough showed an unidentified person of interest dropping Jennifer's vehicle off approximately noon on the very day she went missing. However, none of her family or friends could recognize this person. And of course, the video was not very clear. You couldn't see it very well. It was hid behind some bars of some sort of a fence, and it just wasn't very clear at all. And everybody was disappointed that the best video capture of the person in 3 separate snapshots, it was obscured by this fencing and the posts, and it concealed the face. In fact, my friend, one of the journalists back in those days, I remember this quote, by the way, he called the suspect, quote unquote, the luckiest person of interest ever. Did you hear that? The luckiest person of interest ever. Well, the Orlando police reached out to the FBI to try to help determine the person's size and gender. They could only say, though, the person stood between 5'3" and 5'5". They also did, even NASA enhanced the video to try to identify the subject. They did find that there were valuables left inside the car, which implied that robbery was not a motive in the case. They even brought in dogs, and one dog tracked a scent that went from her parked car all the way back to her apartment, which really caused people to believe that maybe the suspect may have returned to her apartment's parking lot after he abandoned the car. In other words, he had to go back and get his car, or maybe he worked there, who knows? But there was no other evidence that they could find along the route. They did a forensic examination of the car, but found at this point very little way of evidence. They did find one latent print, and a small DNA fiber. They really believed, the investigators at that time, that whoever did this was at least smart enough to wipe the car down. Now, there were some things that was also missing as they began to look. They could not find her cell phone. They could not find her iPod. They could not find her keys. They could not find her purse, her briefcase, or, of course, the outfit that she was wearing, and, of course, not her. They were not able to ping the cell phone, which meant that the power was turned off. And, of course, as investigators do, they looked at her spending, at her bank account to see if anything had happened. And nope, did not happen, had not been used since her disappearance. Now, investigators, they begin to investigate the normal people they do in those cases, and they ruled out several suspects. They ruled out the boyfriend. He had an alibi. He was out of the area. They ruled out the ex-boyfriend. And they even then began to investigate co-workers. There was one there who was a manager who did kind of hit on her, but she told him she wasn't interested in dating anybody from her work. That just didn't work. And besides, she was already involved with someone else. So they ruled out that guy. He had an alibi. But at the time of her disappearance, Jennifer's condo complex, they had been undergoing a major expansion, and a lot of the laborers that owned the site were so-called, quote-unquote, non-English-speaking people. In fact, Jennifer had even told family members on several occasions that the construction workers there constantly catcalled, whistled at, harassed her. But unfortunately, due to this language barrier, investigators were unable to interview many of those people. Now, I think that's very sad, because that was probably one of the most important interviews they could have. It's sad to me that that barrier was not overcome somehow, some way during that time. So in May of 2007, as this investigation is turning colder and colder, Drew's company, led by David Siegel, he actually offered $1 million reward for information leading to her whereabouts, with a July 4th deadline that the stipulation was that she had to be alive. $1 million, if anybody could say anything, and it was a July 4th deadline, and of course it was never claimed. Now, there was also, and I think still remains, a $5,000 reward for information leading to the whereabouts of her remains. That's through the Central Florida crime line we have here. Now, of course, this case by this time received state, national attention. It even got into the lawmakers' hands talking about this case because it had so much attention. And back in 2008, I think it was the month of May, 2008, the month of May, the Florida House of Representatives, they actually passed a bill. It was called Senate Bill 502. That's what it was. Senate Bill 502. And it was called the Jennifer Kesse Missing Persons Act. And it actually reformed missing person cases. It changed the way that these cases are handled in Florida. It required law enforcement agencies to enact written policies for handling such cases. And so as we go along with this case in June of 2010, then this case is actually taken over by the FBI. 2018, well, guess what? I told you that Drew was very active in this investigation. He actually filed suit against the Orlando Police Department, and he found access to the police records in the case. That lawsuit, settled in 2019, allowed the family access, listen to this, 16,000 pages of records. Yep. 2022, well, now the case was turned over to the FDLE, the Department of Law Enforcement, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, Cold Case Unit. But there's something else. There's a reason why people are still hearing today about the Jennifer Kesse case and why we know so much about the Holloway case. Both of those families, Holloway and this family, inserted themselves into the investigation and kept the story alive. One of the things that Jennifer's father did in this case, in addition to suing the city to get his hands on those notes, he actually assembled a team of 13 former investigators. Some from the Secret Service, the FBI, local law enforcement, former officers, to help with the case. They, with their work, put pressure on these other investigation agencies. And now we know, my friend, on May the 20th, 2025, just a couple months ago, on her 44th birthday, the FDLE announced that they had gone through thousands of pages of documents. They spoke to 45 people since the case was turned over to their unit in 2022, and they announced they now have identified several persons of interest in Jennifer's disappearance. And they've stated that this case is no longer considered code. They're hoping that artificial intelligence may help identify that person of interest seen on the camera. And with this new interest, let me say, it is very probable, while it is very probable we'll never see her alive, we may be able to get justice for her. Now, even the family has pretty well ruled out the fact that they'll see her again. She was declared dead by the state of Florida in 2016. But Jennifer's dad is adamant that someone, somewhere, must know something about what happened to his daughter. He said, quote, more than one person knows what happened. He implores them to come forward. He said, no matter how small the information, if you know anything about it, go to a lawyer, go to the police if you feel comfortable, or even go to a priest if you feel comfortable, but say something. If you saw something, say something. Get that information into law enforcement's hands. Now they even have a tip line, 941-201-4009. Again, a tip line, if you know anything about this case, 941-201-4009. We're going to put that in the show notes. And if you want to help them out financially, they do have a Help Us Find Jennifer Fund, and any size donation that you can afford. It's simply a Help Us Find Jennifer Fund. You can look at that. We'll try to find information for that as well. And you can help the foundation if you choose. So to sum it up now, my friend, we have three things going that makes this case hot again. There is some DNA that was located on the car that may now become more valuable with DNA enhancements that had been made in the 19 years since this investigation. And there are now some new persons of interest that are being pursued. Hopefully, now, we're going to see some new traction that will lead to a suspect. And thankfully to a dad, a father, and mother who would not stop in these 19 years seeking justice for their daughter. Drew's one desire before he leaves this life, he was 48 when that happened, around 68 now. His one desire before he leaves his life is to find out what happened to his daughter. Let's help him do that, folks. If you know anything at all, 941-201-4009, call that line. Get a hold of a law enforcement agency. Go to anybody. Tell them if you saw something, say something. Let's help him get that closure. Well, next week, my friend, we're going to continue to talk about Disney crime. That's right, Disney crime. And even another missing woman from Orlando that gained national attention. Next week. Until this time next time, though, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, stay safe, stay alert. For the life you save, it may be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional information and podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. We would like to thank our sponsor, the Peacemaker Network, and also encourage you to support the first responders, military, and law enforcement personnel by contributing to the Peacemaker Network. That's peacemakernetwork.com. All music and sound effects are courtesy of Pixabay.com. That's Pixabay.com. You can also support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, tag @CharlieCrimebuster, and then click the subscribe button. By doing so, you'll be notified each time we drop one of our shows. Another more convenient way for you to listen to our podcasts, or for you to say to your smart speaker, play Charlie Crimebuster. If you have comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you, so please send them to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com, or you can call or text us at 407-917-2211. That's 407-917-2211. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you will join us again for another exciting crime episode with Charlie Crimebuster.